the form of consciousness that Shiva represents is a form of consciousness that we're trying to cultivate and to embody in our yoga practice, right? Because you're with me on that, right? Like that was the theme, okay. And the balance of prana and apana is a technique for helping induce that state of consciousness. So what characterizes that state of consciousness? Well, it's one in which we're not clinging too tightly to any particular idea of what we're experiencing. So in other words, one way that Richard likes to put this, which didn't really resonate with me for a while, but then one day it just did, and so I'll share it with you, and maybe it resonates with you, but he said that you don't pull things out of their background into the forefront of your consciousness, but you allow everything that you experience to be seen, and it's sort of in relation to everything that's in the background. No? Okay. Let that sit for a few years, maybe it will come around. That's how it happened for me. Yeah, that you don't, so the meditative state is one in which, or at least there are different forms of consciousness that might fall into the category of meditative states, right? But the kind of absolute samadhi, contentless experience without support, that, set that aside. I'm not going to talk to you about that because I don't have experience of that. But the meditative state of the state of sort of supported samadhi with content, is one in which you don't pull any of the objects of your experience into the foreground so that you stop seeing them in their fundamental relationality with everything else. So a simple way of putting it is that you see all things as being interconnected, including whatever is immediately presenting itself in your experience. That you don't, but how is it that we pull things out into the foreground and thematize them and make them objects of our narrations? Well, we impose concepts on those things that dramatically limit our idea about their reality. They confine that object to a very particular set of relevances and concerns. Does that make any sense? I don't want to go too far into this, but say if you're talking to another human being and seeing them as a person, you're not really thinking about the chemical composition of their body and the way that that's being impacted by, the environment. Probably. That's probably not a big one. But a human being is, among other things, at least partly, a material object with which one could sort of, in an exceedingly complex one, maybe the most complex sort of object that you could find in the phenomenal world. And yet that's not really what you pay attention to when you talk to someone in ordinary conversation. Are you with me? Right? But the suspension of your concepts about what you're experiencing would mean that any context in which you might situate a particular object, it becomes just as relevant as any other. That's the whole thing about Patanjali's 1,000 serpent heads singing at the same time. He doesn't listen to just any one of them. He's not like, oh, Sanskrit chants, those are the spiritual ones. He's listening to the Sex Pistols over here, and Beyonce is over there, and Parvati here, and chanting in every other religion, and people singing happy birthday, and it's all sacred. It's all equally sublime. Okay? So I'm circling around this point. So the point is this, that when we're talking about that Shiva's cosmic role, I said that his cosmic role was to dissolve things in their proper time, and that when he fails to play that cosmic role, the Asuras get the upper hand in their ongoing battle with the Devas for, and what are they? They're always battling for control over the sky, which is a metaphor for control over the inner space of your mind, which means that there are different functions of the ego, forces of the ego that are sort of vying for control over your agential capacities, so over your behavior, over your conscious thought, over your speech. Okay? Now here's the point I wanted to make, is that Shiva doesn't really care whether the Asuras or the Devas are in control. He doesn't really favor the Devas. It's not as if when the Devas are in control, then the mind is free. Right? Because the Devas are tyrants too. They're just gentler tyrants. They're like passive aggressive, and the Asuras are just openly aggressive, which is kind of admirable, in a way. It's like, who would you rather sit with at dinner? The Asuras or the Devas? I don't know. The gods, the beings of light. Indra, Agni, etc., etc. Vayu, all of their consorts. So the Devas are like the gods. The Asuras are the demons. So the idea is this. That Shiva represents this intercession of consciousness between conditioned impulse and behavior. And when Shiva is there, when Shiva's mediating between your samskaras on the one hand and your thoughts and speech and actions on the other hand, you're no longer being ruled by your conditioning. You're no longer being tyrannized by impulse, right? But either way, being tyrannized by impulse, whether it's a moral impulse or an immoral impulse, is, ultimately indifferent from the perspective of freedom, or from the perspective of authenticity, maybe you might call it. Okay. So the conditions for authenticity and spontaneous action in this conceptual framework are represented by the union of Shiva and Shakti. So when Shakti and Shiva merge into one another, so that consciousness is then mediating between impulse and activity. And when consciousness is Shiva consciousness, which is selfless and all-embracing, right? Then the action that comes out of that arrangement is not reactive, it's not egocentric, it's selfless, and it expresses pure love, adoration without any attachment to an object. So of course it will have a certain kind of quality, right? Like it's not going to have a demonic quality. You can be pretty sure of that because it's selfless, it's not egocentric, right? But you don't want to reduce it to what you might think of as righteous action. You with me? Kinda? It's kind of like, this is one of the main messages of the Bhagavad Gita too, that Krishna has to let go of his attachments to his ideas of righteousness in order to do what needs to be done, which is to act selflessly from love. That's what needs to be done. selfless, loving action without attachment is what is desperately needed in that situation. But then the mind wants to go, but what is that? What morality do we apply to get the right answer? And the mind keeps grasping at these theories about morality in order to try and come up with a rationale for, like, how can Krishna violate the stricture of ahimsa and go to war against, people that he loves and should be respecting, and blah, blah, blah. And the answer is, there is no answer. That's the whole point, is that he's dispossessed of morality. He's dispossessed of these constructs of the intellect that would reassure him that he's doing the righteous thing. He has to give that up so that he can act from a truly selfless, open, spontaneous, authentic place. And for that he needs yoga, so Krishna goes into all the yogas. Right? Okay? Sorry, I thought I was going to make like this little point about the Asuras and the Devas. But that's good enough. It's good? All right. Okay. So I want to take you down the rabbit hole a bit. So when we left off last time, Sati had just thrown herself into the sacrificial fire. She'd thrown herself into the fire that Daksha built in order to make this ritual to a particular idea of fullness. And I said that in doing so, she brought the ritual to its logical culmination, because she represents the principle of feminine creativity, the principle of nature, the principle of phenomenal manifestation, right? The principle that rules over the manifestation of everything that you experience, including all the contents of your mind. That principle that's manifest in everything that you experience, in everything that is the phenomenal world, is what she represents. And we started off with the premise that that principle is irreducible to a concept. It's irreducible to a particular image. Any idea that you might have of it is inadequate to capture what that thing really is. It's always so much more than that. So it's excessive, it's abundant, it's irreducible, uncontrollable, unpredictable, right? And that aspect of it, as we know from modern biology and also from the history of ideas, that aspect of the creative principle constantly mutating and shifting and changing, so that our best attempts to hold it in a scheme of categories are defied. That quality of mutation is like the sine non qua of life itself. It's what helps life evolve. And without that, life would stagnate, and in stagnation there can be no more balance, because balance is something that happens in dynamic circumstances. It's a constant readjustment of one thing to another. So in that stasis, life itself would disappear. Okay? So that quality of excess is and irreducibility is essential to the feminine principle. Daksha, as a sort of orthodox ritualist, is someone who has set himself up as an authority of the sacred, as an authority of this experience of fullness that he will then mediate for others, right? That's sort of his role as a priest, that he's going to mediate this experience of fullness for you. And every time he ritually mediates that experience, of course, he reinforces his own perceived sense of authority and his socially constructed and real authority over other human beings, right? He reinforces it by performing those rituals. And that's its function, because Daksha represents this function of the ego that's continually naming things and putting everything in its proper place. And the ego does that because that gives the ego a sense of solidity, a sense of being able to manage the world by knowing things, knowing where things stand, and then being able to know the relevance of things and how things work, so that the ego can then arrange things for its own benefit, right? But even just having that power at its disposal, like the ego has a limitless hunger for that power, because that power makes it feel safer and more solid and more sort of grounded in itself, right? So Daksha, of course, resents the marriage of Shiva and Sati because that marriage represents consciousness's full embrace of the excess and sublimity of the creative principle. It represents the reaching of consciousness into something that the mind can't contain, right? So it represents something dangerous and subversive. Right? Okay. It also represents something for which we all have a deep inherent longing. Okay? We all have a longing to throw ourselves into the fire, so to speak, by sort of dissolving ourselves into the sublime abyss of otherness through intimate contact with that which is truly other, namely you, those outside you, the other, right? And so we long for each other, we long for these experiences of intimacy with others, because in intimacy we are dispossessed of our limited sense of ourselves. We're dispossessed of that sense of ourselves that makes us feel safe and contained, that sense of ourselves that we tend to stagnate in and sort of rigidify around, right? So we long with that intimacy precisely because it draws us out of ourselves, right? And so the mind sets up defenses against that longing. It sets up defenses against that longing even if it doesn't have, particular experiences of the sublime in its own conscious history. But that experience, so the experiences that draw us into yoga what are those like? Those experiences in which, they tend to happen sort of early on maybe, or maybe they happen outside of yoga, but then yoga reminds you of these experiences. But you have these experiences where you feel elevated above yourself. And you feel somehow, in a way that the intellect can never fully comprehend, you feel a deep sense of continuity with all living beings. And it's profoundly exhilarating, and it's ecstatic in the old Greek sense of the word. It's an ecstasis, it's a taking out of the stability of your sense of yourself. It draws you out of that limiting, confining idea of what you are and gives you this sense of exhilarating, breathtaking, disorienting, maybe terrifying expansiveness. Yeah? Okay. And those experiences are called Shakti Pot. That's Shakti Pot. Sometimes Shakti Pot that word is also referred to as something that a guru gives to a student, like an empowerment. Like, I'm going to get Shakti Pot from this. But the original meaning of the word is just that sort of initial glimmering of the infinite that draws you towards spiritual practice. It's just the name of an experience. It has nothing to do with an external guru or an empowerment. It's just an experience of the sublime that turns you toward the contemplative life. That's Shakti Pot. And how does that experience feel? It feels like a memory. It reminds you of something that you already knew. It may be new in your autobiography. It may be a turning point in the story that you tell about yourself, right? You may even, I don't know, give up all your possessions and, move out of the suburbs. And I don't know. People do. People have, these are big turning points in life sometimes. Or maybe you just keep your office job, but now you have a secret. Okay? But Shakti Pot feels like a memory. Where does that memory come from? I don't want to answer that question. But if it reminds us of something, there are these sort of currents of experience that seem in those moments to sort of reach back, not to something else in our autobiography, but to something earlier, to something before we started telling our story, right? So perhaps back to maybe that sort of prenatal sense of fullness when we were still sort of floating in the feminine waters of creation, still floating in the womb like Vishnu. That sense of fullness in which there is no separation yet between ourselves and any other idea that we have of any other living being, right? That sense of fullness that precedes birth. And Shakti Pot, of course, is often experienced as a kind of rebirth because it sort of returns us to that sense of fullness, and then we come out and it's like, oh, my life, now I begin my new life. And so you start maybe you start retelling your story from that particular point, right? I mean, most spiritual biographies take this form, right? There's like the darkness, and then there's the Shakti Pot, and then there's the story of, spiritual life. But they usually go like that. Okay, so then let's suppose that we all have that memory. Whether you think of yourself as a spiritual person, or a religious person, or an atheist, right? Let's say that that's fundamentally part of the human, if not part of the human experience, then part of the subconscious elements that shape our experience. It's part of our sort of primitive consciousness, a part of our sort of maybe pre-narrative consciousness. Those kinds of experiences that Shakti Pot remind us of, right? And let's suppose that on account of having those elements shape our experiences, we all have, and sort of know that we have on some level this implacable longing to sort of throw ourselves into the abyss, to return to that state, which involves the total dissolution of the ego, right? Let's suppose that on some level we all want that, right? But if we remember that longing is an absolute threat to the ego, then we might be able to make sense of the great diversity of ways in which people sort of cope with that, the different sort of defenses that people put up in order to sort of prevent themselves, in order to mediate that experience, right? So our story, the story that we're going to look at today, is going to draw out and compare, in I think a sort of surprising way, two different ways of mediating that experience. There's Daksha's way and there's Shiva's way. And this particular, in the way that I want us to contemplate this story, we're going to see both of those ways as being profoundly human. Okay? And fraught with suffering. Okay? So Daksha's way, we've already touched on that. It's already sort of half in view. How does Daksha mediate his terrifying longing to throw himself into the sacrificial fire? Right? So to sacrifice his ego into that fire and sort of dissolve back into the plenum of creative energy. Well, he does so by creating a particular image of fullness, right? And by elaborating that image with his religious rituals, right? And that way of mediating the relationship between that longing for the infinite and the abyss itself is a form of idolatry, a form of putting a concept or an image onto the sublime that allows one to sort of reduce it to something that one can meaningfully negotiate with, right? Something that one can cope with. Like for Daksha, he organizes his whole life around that image of fullness, right? He's got all these grand religious rituals, and he's got his robes and his jewelry and his way of carrying himself and talking to people that makes him, that he's the authority of this image, and it defines his relationships with other beings, etc. And what else it allows him to do is to use those rituals to edge close to the abyss, to look over the edge, maybe even to feel the wind rushing up when the pelvic floor opens, right? And the breeze starts to rise up through the central channel and the hair stands up on the back. Like Dakshas is into that as anybody, right? He wants it too. Who doesn't? So Daksha's feeling that, but he's got his own particular way of coping with it and then going, okay, now the ritual's done, drawing back and resettling into the ego so that the ego is not dissolved by the experience, right? But he gets to sort of taste it. He gets to dance with it a little bit, right? He gets to be seduced by it. He gets to be elevated by the excitement of the ritual and the idea of getting close to the feminine sublime, but without actually losing himself in it and being dissolved. Okay?
Is that because of fear?
Yeah.
Or attachment to the ego?
It's because of that fifth and most formidable klesha, abhinivesha, the fear of death, which is an attachment. It's an attachment to life and an attachment to, like a particular, an attachment to life is always an attachment to a particular construct of experience. So it's fear. Okay, so now we'll get to Shiva's way of mediating this, but we're going to put something in the middle. So let's tell a little more story, because that's nice. You can wake back up. Okay. So when Sati throws herself in the fire, Shiva's sitting up on the mountaintop. He already knows he's seen it all with his third eye, right? So he's sitting up there, and Sati falls back into the fire, and Shiva is immediately filled with rage. Okay? And his rage wells up into the center of his chest and springs out from his heart in the form of a demon named Veerabhadra. That's your warrior pose. This is no ordinary warrior. This is the extrusion of Shiva's rage. So if it gets hot and it burns, good. You stay there longer until the smoke comes. So Veerabhadra is an extrusion of Shiva's rage, and he goes screaming down the mountain he's got like thousands of fangs and claws, and he's fiery, he's like a fireball, and he's shrieking and screaming, and goes right down the mountain, and all the ganas are trailing, Shiva's ganas are trailing behind him, but they can't keep up. And Veerabhadra goes into the scene of the sacrifice and just starts dismembering people. He just starts killing the guests, and he's looking for Daksha, but he's just shredding people apart, and the blood is starting to flow all over the scene of the sacrifice. And then the ganas get there, and they're like, they're a bunch of thugs anyway. They're total thugs. So they're just happy to riot, They get there and they're spray painting, they're urinating into the ritual bowls. I didn't make that up, that's really in the literature. They're toppling the tables and just breaking things and setting things on fire and just, having a full-scale riot of it. And Veerabhadra is still shrieking with rage, and he's tearing people apart, and finally he finds Daksha, and without even a moment of dramatic escalation, he just rips his head off. And Daksha's head rolls. And he keeps, shrieking and rolling and trying to, create more violence. But as soon as Daksha's head falls off, he starts sort of losing his power. Because that's what Shiva's rage was all about. But once he sort of has his revenge, he starts losing his power, and so he sort of circles a few times, and then he collapses. He's panting, and his body just sort of emaciates and crumbles, and he just disappears. Not to be seen again for a while. Okay. As this happens, the sky turns dark. The ashes from the fire have sort of filled the air, and the whole scene becomes, the scene's unfolding right in the middle of the day, but it suddenly becomes twilight, and it's a sort of dark, greenish brown twilight. And Shiva comes down the mountain now, and he goes and he pulls the smoldering body of Sati from the sacrificial fire, and he throws her over his shoulder. And so that there are gods and demons still sort of hiding, up in the rafters and out in the trees. And be looking down from above in the heaven, and they're just, everyone's so astonished and traumatized by what happened. So Shiva with Sati's body on his shoulder, he starts swaying back and forth, like he's listening to something. And then he starts making little arcs, little delicate arcs in the soil with his toe, as if you're writing something in some undecipherable script, as if you're sort of writing a final farewell to his beloved. And then he spreads out his four arms, and he starts making gestures that none of the other gods can comprehend. And as he continues to sway, his body becomes sort of more, his gyrations become more and more vivid. He starts sort of taking leaps and jumps from side to side. He starts jumping over rivers and into valleys and then back over again. and his gyrations become violent. His hair starts to whip, and it's like threatening to knock the stars out of the sky. It's so intense. And so the gods and demons both are terrified by this dance because it's exuding this searing grief, and the grief is coming out in waves and just flooding the hearts of all of these other beings with sorrow. And the sorrow is so intense and so blistering that it's sort of threatening the very fabric of this realm. The friction that Shiva's creating through his gyrations through the air is threatening to set the air on fire. And so they look at Vishnu like, what? Vishnu's like the only one who's maybe powerful enough to do anything about it. Not as powerful as Shiva, but, close. So Vishnu takes his discus and he starts trying to throw it at Sati to to hack her body off or something, to make him stop. But he can't predict the movements of Shiva. He's throwing the discus and it keeps, missing and I guess circling back. So finally he just starts lunging at Shiva and, savagely hacking with the side of his discus and hacking little pieces of her body off. And so Shiva's dancing, and he's dancing in the north of India, and these little pieces of Sati's body are falling off, and the places where her body falls become sacred sites. You can actually visit these Shakti temples in northern India, where each of the parts of Sati's body are said to have fallen. And when the body is totally dismembered, Shiva finally stops dancing. And he falls to the ground, heaving and panting, and everyone's, all the gods are heaving and panting too, so relieved. The air's risen to 50 degrees Celsius. It's like a Bikram class, everyone's totally, all right. And so Shiva stops, and he stays in Assam is where the vulva of the yoni of the goddess is said to have fallen. He stays there a particularly long time, meditating on her, trying to sort of feel her presence, which to him has been lost. And his grief is the grief of profound isolation, of aloneness. So Sati for Shiva represented the embodiment of the feminine principle. And so with Sati gone, he's completely estranged from the creative force, completely estranged from the feminine. Because to him, Sati was, and she was, the complete embodiment of that principle. Now she's gone. Okay? So this image of the dancing Shiva, it's called the Nataraj. And there's probably one around somewhere in Purple Valley. Do you guys have a Nataraj? Is there one in here? No, not right now. But you guys know this image, right, of the dancing Shiva. So he's standing on one foot. He's standing on his right foot. There's a little dwarf underneath his right foot called Apsmara. I think I'm saying that right. Who represents ignorance, the illusion of forgetting. And so Shiva's standing on him. He's got a ring of fire arcing up around him. He's got his left foot raised. He's got 4 arms. Okay? In his upper right hand, he's holding a damaru drum, which is a little hourglass-shaped drum, right? And of course, the juxtaposition of the upward and downward facing triangles, like you have in the Sri Yantra over here, represent the interfusion of Shiva and Shakti. So in the Damaru drum, these two principles are not interfused, they're just touching at a point. And that point in Yantra theory, or the theory of sacred geometry, is called the Bindu. It's the point out of which all creation unfolds. The point at which consciousness and creative force come together, right? So we're in the Bindu. This is the Bindu. It's a good time, you know? It's a good place to be. I mean, if you could be anywhere, right? You want to be right here, where consciousness and creative energy are colliding and manifesting as sensory experience. Oh, that's good news. Here we are. So the Damaru drum, you know, it represents like the sort of pulsing vibration of creation. And so in some tantric views, the universe, and you know, of course, there are modern scientific analogs of this, but they conceive manifest creation as a sort of three-dimensional matrix of vibrational energy called spanda. Yeah? And so that the Damaru, the drum that sort of beats out the you know, it sort of beats out vibration, beats out the pulse of creation, represents srishti. Srishti, or the movement of creation, the manifestation of creative energy. Okay? The Shiva's lower right hand is held in Abhaya Mudra. And this mudra, which you see not only in Indian iconography, but in Christian iconography too. And not only in Indian and Christian iconography, but it means, Abhaya literally means fear not. You see Jesus doing this, right? But his finger is usually like that. Fear not. And this is like, it's a mudra of protection or reassurance. And so if you have an image of a deity saying, fear not, it means that you don't have to fear that all of this is going to be, that the ground is going to be pulled out from beneath your feet. You can relax into your experience and sort of trust in the unfoldment of the creative energy without fearing that you're simply going to dissolve. Okay? So that's Abhaya Mudra. And then his upper, and so that represents the creative movement, that represents the act that's known as sthiti, or stasis, right? Like the sort of, the sustaining of a particular creative form. Yeah, same word. Yeah, but it's like the standing steady of a creative form. The left hand, the upper left hand, is holding Agni. It's holding a little flame. Okay, and that represents the power of dissolution, the power to burn things, the power to reduce things to ashes. And so return them back to their ground, return them back to emptiness, right? Return them, to dissolve them. It represents the creative act of samhara, or dissolution. The lower left arm of Shiva is in what's called Danda Asta Mudra, which is just pointing down, a finger pointing down, you know, and then the Abhaya Mudra is here. And then if I had two more arms, which would make me an amazing Mysore teacher, I'd have some fire here and the Damaru drum there. Okay? And then the left foot is lifted like this. So the Dandasta Mudra is pointing down to the left foot, but this arm is also going across Shiva's heart. Okay? So this represents concealment because he's concealing what's really in his heart. Okay? And that's called Tirodhana. Tirodhana is concealment. Okay? And then the foot that's lifted, the left foot, so as you know, throughout India and throughout Indian culture, the feet of the teacher are considered sacred. So a way of showing reverence to a teacher, and it's a particularly loaded way of showing reverence, so don't do it to me. But people do this. I have dirty feet anyway, you don't want to. But a particular way of showing reverence is to touch the feet of the teacher, right? And sometimes they touch the feet and then touch the head, or touch the feet, touch the heart, right? And because the teacher they're like the vehicle of the knowledge. They've walked the path. They've tread the path that you want to walk, right? And so the dust on the feet is sacred. It's like a crystallization of it knows that dust is like from the other side. So you get the dust and you put it on your head and hope that somehow has an effect, okay? So the feet, and then it's considered auspicious to put the feet, you can take the sandals of the teacher if they're not looking and put them on your head. Yeah. This is a gesture that you see in mythic iconography, putting the sandals of the teacher on the head, so that it represents the outpouring of grace. Grace descends from the feet of the teacher. Okay? The outpouring of grace is called Anugraha, which is a beautiful word. Anugraha. Okay? So these 5 gestures that we just went over, Srishti, or creation, Sthiti, or stasis, stability, Samhara, dissolution, Tirodhana, concealment, and Anugraha, or grace. These are, in various tantric traditions, particularly in Kashmir Shaivism, known as the 5 acts of creation. Okay? They're the 5 acts of the goddess, the 5 ways in which the creative power of the goddess unfolds. And so it's said, those 5 acts are said to give a complete, it's a schema for every natural phenomenon. So every movement of your mind is one or other of those acts, right? And, if you turn it a little bit and look at it from a different point of view, it's a perspectival thing, so then it might be, the same thing might be a different act viewed from another perspective, right? Because the cycles of our minds are like, when does one cycle end and when does the other begin? Well, it depends what story you're telling about them, right? Because it's really like a stream of, not even a stream, it spreads out and there are all these overlapping cycles, right? Things that are part of one cycle might be a little part of another, or a really big part of this cycle, or you didn't realize that they were part of that cycle until you looked at them from another perspective, right? And in this cycle, maybe it's Tirodhana, and then in another cycle, Anugraha. So, the fact that Shiva's left hand is in Dandasana, the arm that conceals, is pointing down to the symbol of Anugraha, which is the act that reveals. Right? So it's said that the goddess, through her Maya, through her power of unfoldment, through the power of creating this illusion of separately existing beings, right, which are then capable of sensory experience, that act that gives us our sense of isolation from one another also is the very act that enables us to have a revelation of the continuity of all beings. Okay? So, to put this in a way that's maybe a little facile or clever. I hate clever, but it's the best I can do sometimes. It's like the goddess puts a veil over experience, right? And that veil makes us see reality as being composed of, a constellation of sort of isolated beings that maybe seem discontinuous from one another, right? But it's only because the veil is there that we have the possibility of seeing through the veil. And so having a revelation that all of those separate beings are sort of continuous after all. And that's the, right? So that's what the goddess gives to Shiva. See, without the goddess, without the power of Maya unfolding in the space of consciousness doesn't see itself at all. Right? Shakti just is Shiva's power of unfoldment. And Shiva just is Shakti's consciousness. So neither is derivative from the other. It's not like Eve being made from the rib of Adam, right? Shiva without Shakti is a miserable being. He doesn't have self-consciousness. It's Shakti that makes him aware of himself, right? And Shiva's powerless without Shakti, because Shakti is his power. So Shiva's just representing this sort of, he's pure consciousness, which is really, what is pure consciousness? There's this idea in modern German philosophy that, people in cognitive science and phenomenology have made a lot of, which is called, what's it called? Well, it doesn't matter. But the idea is that consciousness fundamentally has the nature of intentionality. And Husserlian phenomenology and all is all based off of this very idea. That consciousness is always of something. So you can't talk about consciousness separate from its objects. It doesn't make sense. What is that? But then in Indian philosophy, you have this very idea, pure consciousness. So you think like, it's called Brentano's thesis. That's what it's called. And the consciousness always has an object, right? And it's supposed to be a priori, which means that it's self-evident to reflection. You just think about it like, consciousness is always of something. And it's not because you think back and go, well, let me think of all my phases of consciousness. Were they always about something? It's not like that. It's just that well, what the hell would consciousness of nothing be, right? But of course, since we're yogis, we have there's this sort of popular image you have an idea of, contentless, supportless samadhi because you've read about it. So then, but it's probably like an image in your head, like it has a particular, maybe it's filled with light, or maybe it's dark, or maybe it's kind of looks like outer space, but it's just an image, right? But the thing itself is not that, and whatever that thing is, it's not really a thing at all. It's not really anything. But that's the point. It's not that Indian mythology got it wrong, it's that Indian mythology understood Brentano's thesis and then played around with it, thousands of years before Brentano. Are you guys with me? Good. So Shiva, the fact that Shiva is holding that Damaru drum in his right hand, right? I have the power of creation, like he's beating the drum of creation, right? That's not a slight to Shakti's power, right? Because Shakti just is Shiva's power. He's sort of emulating, and in fact, we're getting a little closer to the substance of the story, that it's Shakti dancing through Shiva. Shiva can't dance without Shakti. But he doesn't see that. He doesn't realize that. He doesn't realize that the grief that he's feeling is just another emanation of Shakti, that she's right there. She's acting through him. She's enveloping him. She's embracing him. Everything that he's feeling, including his grief, is her immediate presence to him, right? But, and here's the thing, Shiva, in his romantic infatuation, formed a particular image of his beloved, of that which is truly and infinitely lovable, right? He formed a particular image of her, and he reduced the feminine sublime to that image. And so, when she departed, he's, on an emotional level, completely estranged, right? Because his whole idea of the feminine was bound up in that particular image. And that, too, is a form of idolatry. It has the exact same structure as Dakshas Orthodox ritualism. Isn't it heartbreaking? And what happens, we don't have enough time to just to go into the next part of the story, because the story has many chapters, but Shiva's grief goes on. It goes on for a while. And the next parts of this story show Shiva sort of enacting his grief, like wallowing in grief, and even sort of lashing out at others because he's so emotionally isolated, right? As if to reinforce this idea that Shiva's lost. It's reinforcing the idea that Shiva's lost without Shakti, but it's also humanizing the experience so that this experience can become a true allegory for the progression of human consciousness, right? And I think the lesson here, it sounds a little brutal so far, but hold on. The idea is not to criticize love as a form of idolatry. It's to see that this act of the mind by which we project images onto our experience and so give meaning to our experience and so meaningfully engage with the world and meaningfully engage with with others is not optional. It's not something that you could just give up. It's not like, well, I went to this yoga retreat and I learned about, the dangers of naming and categorizing, so I just transcended that. Yeah, right? I mean, it would be just as stupid as being like, love, that's just, romantic love, that's just a form of idolatry. I'm not going to go there. I mean, you could do that. You could work yourself into that kind of swoon. People do, right? And then you could become, truly miserable because you could try and disengage from these cycles of emotional life that are not only nearly unavoidable, right? But that play on our very deepest desires, our longing, right? To throw ourselves into the sacrificial fire, to complete that sacrifice, our longing to melt into the other, to melt into the sublime reality of the other, right? We have that longing, we have to cope with it somehow. What do we do, right? So so remember, the act that conceals is also the act that reveals, right? So when Sati throws herself in the fire, she pulls herself away from Shiva. Shiva experiences this as an estrangement from the feminine sublime. He experiences it as tirodhana, as a concealment. You see what I mean? That's how he experiences it. But the goddess warned that if she was reduced to an idea, that if she wasn't recognized as being irreducible and excessive and sublime, that she would withdraw from the world. So she's fulfilling her promise. Why is she doing that? Well, there's always that fifth act, that act of Newgraha, that act of grace, right? And the idea is that the same gesture that conceals is the gesture that reveals. So how does it reveal? How does the desolation, that sort of unimaginable suffering of losing the person that you love the most in the world, that kind of suffering, that sharpest of all suffering, how does that reveal the nature of the goddess? Well, Sati has to throw herself in the fire because both Daksha and Shiva have reduced her to a concept. They can no longer see her for what she is. They see an idea of her. They're both attached to a particular idea of what she's like. So she dissolves herself into the fire so that they let go of that idea completely, so that she can then re-emerge and reincarnate and body forth as something entirely unique, as something totally unlimited by preconception. Yeah? And seduce Shiva all over again. Yeah? And that's the cycle. It's loving and losing, and then falling in love again, that reveals the continuity of those different objects of desire. Because of course when she comes back, she leaves Shiva to wallow for a while, because this is the human experience. Even Shiva, the most adept of yogis, right? He's not above experiencing grief. Man, he loved her more than anything, and she killed herself? Doesn't matter how much yoga, right? He's going to experience deep existential grief, right? Because he loved so deeply that woman, because he dares to do that most treacherous, sort of insane thing, which is to fall madly in love, right? But it's only because he dares to do that thing that when the goddess reappears in a different body with a different name, and Shiva falls in love again, he recognizes her. It's Shakti Pot all over again. He recognizes her as his true beloved. He recognizes her as the full embodiment of the feminine. Sati was the full embodiment of the feminine, and in that, she was just like any other woman. But Shiva had to lose her and then fall in love again in order to appreciate that. Yeah? So that very same act by which Sati throws herself into the fire, right? And so conceals her from Shiva's gaze is also the act by which she creates the possibility for a Newgraha, or grace, for this revelation that every being, every man, every woman, every animal is infinitely worthy of love, because everyone is a complete embodiment of that irreducible, excessive, abundant, unpredictable, uncontrollable, creative principle. And that's the beloved. It's a good story.